Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the grand colosseums or the marble temples, but to the dining tables of ancient Rome. Now, before you picture a lavish spread of perfectly roasted meats and fine wine, let me give you a little reality check. You're probably not going to want to eat a single thing we talk about tonight. In fact, if you were a time traveler dropped into a typical Roman kitchen, you'd probably turn around and run screaming for the nearest modern-day convenience store. This isn't a story of glorious banquets. It's a deep dive into the very real, often stomach-churning and sometimes downright dangerous truth of what these people actually ate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the early days of the Roman Republic, long before the emperors and their extravagant parties. Here the world is simpler, and so is your plate. The ground beneath your feet is what matters most, and the food you eat reflects that. Your ancestors, the founders of this burgeoning city-state, didn't have much, and their diet was a testament to survival and practicality. You're not eating for pleasure, you're eating for fuel for the long days of farming and fighting that lie ahead. The cornerstone of your existence is grain, and it dominates your diet in a way that's hard to fathom today. It's not just a side dish. It's the main event, the star of every meal. Imagine a large circular stone quern, the kind you'd see in a historical museum, and you're pushing it, grinding coarse grain into a rough flour. This flour, often made from emmer wheat, is your bread, your porridge, your lifeblood. It's not the soft, fluffy bread you might grab from a supermarket shelf. This is dense, heavy, and often a little gritty from the stone dust that inevitably mixes in. You might bake it into a flat, unleavened cake called a libum, which you'd eat with a little cheese or honey. Or more commonly, you'd boil it into a thick, simple porridge called pulse. Pulse is to the early Romans what rice is to many cultures today. It's the foundation, the canvas upon which all other flavors, however scarce, are painted. It's a bit bland, a bit mushy, but it fills you up, and that's what counts. You spend a lot of time in the fields, so it's no surprise that vegetables are a huge part of your life. Legumes are king. You're growing chickpeas, lentils, and fava beans, and you're eating them constantly. They're dried and stored for the winter, boiled into soups and stews, and sometimes mashed into a kind of Roman hummus. These aren't just cheap fillers, they're packed with protein and nutrients, and they're essential for your survival. Think of a bowl of lentil soup. Now remove all the seasonings you typically add, the garlic, the onions, the bay leaves. What you're left with is a simple, earthy, and profoundly utilitarian meal. This is your reality. You might get lucky and have a few onions or some garlic to add, but these are often considered luxuries, not staples. You might also gather wild herbs and greens from the surrounding countryside, but your diet is by modern standards incredibly monochromatic and repetitive. Meat is a rare treat. When it does appear on your plate, it's a big deal. You're not eating beef or pork with the same frequency as we do. Pigs are expensive to raise, and cows are valuable for their milk and for plowing fields. Instead, you're more likely to eat goat or sheep, and often only after the animal has passed its useful life for other purposes. And when you do eat meat, you don't waste a single part. Every bit of the animal from the snout to the tail is used. You might make a sausage from the blood and offal, or boil down the bones for a rich, gelatinous stock. Nothing is thrown away because nothing can be. This practice isn't born of some noble ecological principle, it's born of necessity. The concept of a prime cut is a foreign one. You're just happy to have the protein no matter what form it takes. This agricultural focus also means your palate is shaped by the seasons. You eat what's available when it's available. There are no refrigerated trucks bringing fresh strawberries to your local market in the middle of winter. In the spring, you feast on fresh greens and young vegetables. In the summer, you enjoy figs, apples, and grapes. In the winter, you rely on dried goods, dried lentils, dried figs, and salted meat. The rhythm of your meals is the rhythm of the year, a cycle that dictates your entire existence. The predictability of it all is both comforting and monotonous. Every year, you know exactly what you'll be eating and when, and there's very little room for spontaneity. Now, let's talk about one of the most surprising staples of this era, cheese. But not the cheese you're thinking of. This is hard, salty, and often made from sheep or goat milk. It's not for snacking, it's a vital source of fat and protein. You'd grate it over your pulse or mix it into your bread dough. It's a preservative, a nutritional powerhouse, and a key ingredient in almost everything. This is a common historical fact, but here's a lesser-known detail. The earliest Roman cheeses were often a bit funky, sometimes aged in ways that would make a modern cheesemonger faint. They weren't a luxury product. They were a workhorse of a food designed for longevity and sustenance. As you sit down for a meal, a simple wooden table is set with a few earthenware bowls. There's a piece of hard bread, a bowl of lentil soup, and maybe a few pickled vegetables. You eat with your hands, scooping up the food with your fingers or a piece of bread. Forks are a long way off. Your drink is water or very watered-down wine. Wine in these early days is more about making water safe to drink than it is about getting drunk. The fermentation process kills off some of the bacteria, making it a safer option than untreated water from a nearby stream. It's usually a thick, cloudy concoction, nothing like the clear, crisp vintages you might be used to. It's an interesting parallel to the beer for breakfast trend in some historical contexts, necessity driving the consumption of fermented beverages. The academic debate that still lingers is whether the early Roman diet was as purely agrarian as it seems. While the evidence points to a heavy reliance on grains and vegetables, some historians argue that the consumption of wild game and fish was more widespread than we give it credit for, especially in the countryside. The written records are scant for this period, and a lot of what we know is based on archaeological evidence like bone fragments and preserved grains. So while we can piece together a general picture, the fine details of what exactly was on every Roman's plate remain a subject of ongoing discussion. Were they secretly hunting more rabbits and catching more fish than the written histories suggest? It's a tantalizing thought that for now remains an open question. The simplicity of this food is a reflection of the Roman values of the time, austerity, discipline, and a focus on the collective good. There's no room for decadence or excess. Your meals are functional, fueling you for the hard work of building an empire. You're part of a community and you often share meals with your neighbors, a communal experience that reinforces social bonds. The idea of a private, lavish dinner party is still a distant fantasy. For now, it's all about the basics: a full stomach, a strong back, and the promise of another day. You finish your meal, wipe your hands on a piece of bread that you then eat, and get ready for the long day ahead. The sun is just starting to rise and the fields are calling your name. This isn't a glamorous life, but it is a real one. It's a world where a bowl of porridge is a blessing, and a piece of cheese is a source of strength. You don't have a lot, but you have enough, and for now, that's all that matters. You're laying the groundwork for a civilization that will one day feast on flamingo tongues and dormice. But for now, you're content with your humble bowl of peels. This is where the story begins, with the soil and the sweat of a people who were in every sense of the word grounded. The future will bring unimaginable change to your dining table, but for now, you are happy just to eat, to survive, and to build. The journey from this simple meal to the bizarre excesses of the empire is a long one, and it's a story we're just beginning to tell. You're starting to feel the shift. The simplicity of the early republic is fading, replaced by the relentless expansion of the Roman state. As your legions conquer new lands, from the fertile fields of Gaul to the sun-drenched shores of Egypt, new things are pouring into the city. Gold slaves, and perhaps most importantly for our story, new ingredients. The humble pulse is no longer enough for the burgeoning elite. They want more, and they have the wealth to get it. The simple agrarian diet that defined your ancestors is becoming a distant memory, replaced by a new philosophy of dining, one of excess display, and frankly, a little bit of showing off. You're at a dinner party hosted by a wealthy senator, and the scene is a world away from the humble meals of the past. The room is not a simple kitchen, but a dedicated dining room. A triclinium named for the 3 couches arranged in a U shape around a low table. You don't sit at a chair, you recline leaning on your left elbow. This posture isn't just about comfort, it's a display of leisure. You are so rich you don't even need to sit up to eat. You can just lie there being fed and let others do the work. The air is thick with the scent of spices you've never smelled before: cinnamon. From Arabia, peppercorns from India, and a strange pungent herb called silphium from modern-day Libya, which will disturbingly be driven to extinction by the Romans' own insatiable appetite. The meal begins not with a bowl of porridge, but with an array of appetizers or gustaccio. Small, delicate plates are brought out. You might be served boiled eggs seasoned with honey and pepper, or maybe some exotic salads with lettuce and endive dressed in a rich oil. The truly wealthy are even eating snails fattened on milk in special pens, or roasted dormice, a delicacy so prized that they had special clay pots called gliraria to raise and fatten them. This is a common historical fact, but here's a particularly strange detail. Some of these dormice were so prized that they were force-fed a mix of nuts and honey, and even had their eyes sewn shut so they wouldn't get upset and lose weight. It's a level of decadent cruelty that perfectly encapsulates the Roman elite's attitude towards food. The goal isn't just to eat, it's to consume something so rare, so difficult to obtain, that it signals your status to everyone in the room. The main courses, or primi mense, are where things get truly wild. The dishes are designed to be spectacles, not just meals. The cooks, who are often highly trained slaves, are artists. You might be served a peacock still with its colorful feathers reattached, or a wild boar roasted whole and brought to the table on a massive platter. The sheer size of these animals is meant to impress. You see a dish that looks like a roasted pig, but when the cook carves it, open out come a dozen live thrushes fluttering wildly around the room. This isn't just food, it's a theatrical performance, a piece of entertainment to be talked about for weeks. The flavors themselves are a riot of contradictions. They mix sweet and savory in a way that would be jarring to the modern palate. Dishes are often sweetened with honey and date syrup, and then doused in a salty fermented fish sauce called garum. The combination of sugar, salt, and spices is intense, designed to overwhelm the senses and mask the flavor of the food itself. This is an era before refrigeration, so strong seasonings are also a practical way to hide the taste of meat that might be on the verge of turning. The most famous cookbook from this era, a collection of recipes attributed to a man named Apicius, is a testament to this new culinary philosophy. It's not a book of simple practical meals, it's a guide to excess. The recipes call for ingredients like flamingo tongue, sow's womb, and camel heels. They feature complex sauces and preparations that require a small army of kitchen staff. The text is written for the elite, for those who can afford to turn a meal into an event. The academic debate that continues is whether these recipes were actually cooked on a regular basis, or if they were more of a boast, a theoretical list of what was possible for the wealthiest Romans. Were these dishes everyday occurrences for the likes of the Emperor Nero, or were they reserved for the most important feasts? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but the fact that a cookbook exists with these recipes tells you everything you need to know about the direction Roman food was heading. Dining at this level is not just about the food, it's a social ritual. The order of the courses, the quality of the wine, the entertainment provided, all of it is meticulously planned. Between courses, you might be entertained by poets, musicians, or even dancers. You would engage in witty conversation, sometimes discussing the latest political gossip or a philosophical debate. The conversation, however, is often a thinly veiled opportunity to show off your knowledge and status. The meal itself is a performance, and you are both a participant and a spectator. It's all part of the grand spectacle that is Roman high society. The food is simply the backdrop for this larger show. The drink of choice is wine, but it's not what we would recognize as wine. It's often thick, sweet, and heavily spiced. To make it more palatable, it's almost always mixed with water. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as a barbaric act, something done by the uncivilized Gauls or Germans. The wine itself is often fermented in large clay jars called amphorae, and can have a surprising amount of lead in it, as lead was used to sweeten it and as a preservative. Remember that little warning I gave you about not surviving in this world? This is a great example. You're not just at risk of food poisoning, you're also at risk of heavy metal poisoning. And for a truly bizarre experience, you might drink something called passum, a sweet dessert wine made from raisins and flavored with spices. The dessert, or second day mense, is not an afterthought. It's a final flourish, a last chance to impress. You might be served fruit like figs and dates, often stuffed with nuts and honey. Or perhaps a rich cheesecake sweetened with honey and made with a mixture of ricotta-like cheese and eggs. The Romans didn't have refined sugar, so all their sweets relied on honey or fruit juices. This means their desserts are often less about pure sweetness and more about a complex, earthy flavor. Think of a rich honey-drenched cheesecake with a hint of spice and you're getting close. It's a far cry from a modern chocolate cake, but it's a fitting end to a meal that has been an assault on the senses from start to finish. This is the world of the Roman elite, a world of lavish feasts and disturbing excesses. It's a world where food is a weapon of social status, a tool to display wealth and power. The simplicity of the past is gone, replaced by a dizzying array of flavors, textures, and theatrical displays. But as you recline on your couch, sipping your watered-down, lead-laced wine, remember that this isn't the reality for the vast majority of the city's population. The very same city that enjoys these feasts also has a dark, grimy underbelly where most people are just trying to survive. As the night winds down and you're carried home in your litter full of exotic foods and spiced wine, you are acutely aware that your feast is built on the backs of the poor and the enslaved. The feast is over, the wine has been drunk, and the wealthy are asleep in their villas. Now, as the sun begins to peek over the horizon, we leave the marble floors and silk couches behind and descend into the grimy, bustling streets of Rome. This is the reality for the vast majority of the city's population. The plebeians, the freedmen, the slaves. Here, a full stomach is a luxury, not a guarantee. The food of the Roman street is a stark contrast to the opulence of the elite, a story of survival told through meager rations and questionable ingredients. You're a Roman commoner, and your day begins early. Your apartment or insula is a multi-story building, often shoddily constructed and prone to fire. You don't have a kitchen. Cooking inside is a recipe for disaster. So your meals are a patchwork of what you can afford, what you can make on a small portable brazier, and what you can buy from the many street vendors. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and something else, a sharp, pungent odor that permeates everything. That's the smell of garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce which you'll encounter everywhere from the humblest street stall to the most lavish feast. It's a bit like the smell of a very old, very strong cheese mixed with the sea, and it's a smell you'll never forget. Your morning meal or ientaculum is probably a simple affair. A piece of bread, a few olives, or maybe some figs. The bread isn't the fine white bread of the wealthy. It's a coarse, dark loaf made from low-grade wheat. It's hard, dense, and a bit sour, but it's cheap and it fills you up. You might dip it in water or wine to soften it. This is a far cry from the light, fluffy pastries we might think of for breakfast. It's a meal of necessity, not pleasure. The real action happens around midday when it's time for prandium, the Roman equivalent of lunch. The streets are lined with food stalls and small eateries called thermopylae. Think of them as Roman fast food joints. They have large earthenware pots called dolia built into a counter, and they serve hot food to the masses. The food is cheap, quick, and disturbingly often of questionable quality. You might get a bowl of a thick bean and vegetable stew or maybe some fried chickpeas. It's all a bit greasy, a bit salty, and designed to fill you up as quickly and cheaply as possible. This is a common historical fact, but here's a disturbing detail because these establishments didn't have running water. They often used urine to clean their dishes, a practice that, while effective in some ways, likely contributed to the spread of disease. The food from the thermopylae is a mix of the familiar and the foreign. You'll find a version of the poles that your ancestors ate, but it's often made from cheaper grains and is heavily spiced with pepper and garum to mask any off flavors. You might also find things like sausages made from a mix of organ meats and blood, often sold sizzling on a grill. These sausages are a crucial source of protein for the poor, but their ingredients are a mystery. You just hope for the best. The academic debate that still rages is about the nutritional quality of this street food. Some historians argue that while it was often unsanitary, it provided a surprisingly balanced diet of protein, vegetables, and carbohydrates. Others argue that it was often contaminated and led to a high rate of illness and malnutrition. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, a precarious balance between getting enough to eat and avoiding a trip to the latrine. Fish is a more common source of protein than meat for the average Roman. The Tiber River is a source of eels and other freshwater fish, and a bustling fish market sells everything from small anchovies to larger sea bass. But for the poor, the fish is often dried, salted, or cured. It's a cheap way to get protein and can be stored for a long time. You might buy a few small salted fish and eat them whole bones and all. It's a crunchy, salty experience that's a world away from the fresh grilled fish of the wealthy. The poor also have to rely on the state for some of their food. The Roman government distributed free or subsidized grain, a program known as the annona. This grain was a lifeline for the city's poor, providing them with the raw materials for their bread and porridge. However, the quality of this grain could vary wildly. It was often full of dirt, chaff, and sometimes even rat droppings. You would have to spend a lot of time cleaning it before you could even think about grinding it into flour. This is a grim but important detail. The state's benevolence was often a messy, inefficient affair. The Roman poor also had a sweet tooth, but like the wealthy, they didn't have refined sugar. Their desserts were simple fruit, often dried figs or dates, and sometimes a simple porridge sweetened with honey. You might also get a type of sweetened fritter, a bit like a modern donut from a street vendor. These were often fried in olive oil and then drizzled with honey. It's a simple pleasure in a world full of hardship. You remember that little joke I made about not surviving? You probably wouldn't survive the food, but you'd also be at risk of disease just from the sheer lack of sanitation. The food in many ways is a reflection of the city itself, a mix of grandeur and squalor, a place where the rich and poor live side by side but inhabit two completely different worlds. The day ends with scene of the evening meal. For the poor, this is often the largest and most substantial meal of the day. It might be a simple vegetable and lentil stew, or a piece of salted pork if you're lucky. You eat with your family gathered around a small table sharing what little you have. The meal is not a spectacle. It's a quiet, private moment of rest before another day of hard work. The difference between your meal and the feast of the wealthy is not just a matter of ingredients. It's a matter of philosophy. For the rich, food is a tool of power. For you, it's a tool of survival. The two worlds are so close and yet so far apart. You finish your meal grateful for a full stomach, and you get ready for bed knowing that tomorrow the cycle of work and survival will begin all over again. The streets of Rome are a whirlwind of life, a constant buzz of commerce and activity. But beneath the surface, a dangerous secret lurks, a truth that could make even the most hardened legionary lose their appetite. The food you're eating, whether it's a lavish feast or a simple bowl of street stew, is a potential poison. The ancient Romans, for all their engineering and architectural brilliance, had a disturbingly casual relationship with food safety and hygiene. The very things that made their food so delicious could also be the very things that brought about their demise. You're at a baker's shop, and you watch as a baker kneads dough with his bare hands. The flour is dusty, the water is drawn from a public fountain, and flies buzz around the loaves. He's adding a white powder to the dough to make it whiter and softer, a quality that the Romans highly prized in their bread. This is a common historical fact, but here's the unsettling detail that white powder is often ground chalk or lime, a practice that, while not immediately lethal, could cause serious digestive issues and nutritional deficiencies over time. And for a truly disturbing surprise, some Roman bakers would use alum, a chemical compound, to make their bread appear whiter and puffier. Imagine biting into a seemingly delicious piece of bread, unaware that it's been tampered with in such a way. The food is also a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. Without refrigeration, meat and fish often spoiled quickly. The Romans had no concept of germ theory. They didn't know that invisible microbes could make them sick. Instead, they relied on two main methods to preserve their food: salting and fermentation. You remember that ubiquitous fish sauce garum? It was a genius solution to the problem of preservation. By fermenting fish in salt for months, they created a product that wouldn't spoil and could be used to flavor everything. But the process itself was incredibly unsanitary. The garum was often made in open-air vats exposed to flies and the elements, and the process would sometimes fail, resulting in a rancid, contaminated product. And then there's the problem of lead. The Romans had a dangerous love affair with the metal. They used it to line their pipes and to make their cooking pots and pans. But perhaps most dangerously, they used it to sweeten their wine and grape juice. They would boil grape juice in lead pots to create a syrup called defrutum or cepa. This process concentrated the sugars in the juice, making it a powerful sweetener. but it also leached a significant amount of lead into the liquid. This is a common historical fact, but here's a detail that will make you squirm. The lead would give the liquid a sweet taste, which the Romans enjoyed. They were unknowingly poisoning themselves one spoonful of sweet syrup at a time. The cumulative effects of this lead poisoning, including neurological damage and reproductive issues, have been debated by historians for centuries. The academic debate that still rages is about the extent of lead poisoning in Roman society. While we have a lot of archaeological and chemical evidence to suggest that lead was a widespread problem, some historians argue that the Roman elite who had more exposure to these lead-laced products were not as affected as one might think. They point to the fact that the rich often had better nutrition and healthcare, which might have helped them mitigate some of the effects. But others argue that the decline of the Roman Empire was at least partially caused by widespread lead poisoning, which affected the mental and physical health of the ruling class. It's a tantalizing theory that for now remains an open question. The Roman fascination with certain foods also led to some truly bizarre and dangerous practices. You might see a vendor selling pickled vegetables, but the jars they use are not always clean. Or you might buy a piece of cheese from a street stall, unaware that it's been handled by countless people and left out in the sun all day. The lack of understanding about germs and sanitation meant that every meal was a roll of the dice. You were constantly at risk of dysentery, typhoid, or other foodborne illnesses. This is a far cry from our modern world of pasteurization and food safety regulations. You would have to have a stomach of steel to survive on a Roman diet. Even the water you drank was not always safe. While the aqueducts were a marvel of engineering, the water was not always clean. It could be contaminated with animal waste, agricultural runoff, and other pollutants. The wealthy could afford to have their water filtered or boiled, but the poor often had to drink it as it was or mix it with wine to make it safer. This is another grim reality of Roman life. Even the most basic necessity, water, was a potential source of illness. So, as you recline on your couch or stand in a queue for your daily ration of grain, remember that your meal is not just a source of nourishment. It's a gamble. It's a risk. The flavors you enjoy, the bread you eat, the wine you drink, they are all part of a larger, more disturbing truth. The Romans, for all their power and sophistication, were still at the mercy of their environment and their own ignorance. They built an empire, but they never fully conquered the silent, invisible threats that lay in wait on their plates and in their cups. The very thing that sustained them was also in many ways slowly poisoning them. You're back at a wealthy Roman dinner party, but this time you're not just admiring the spectacle. You're looking at it with a new, more critical eye. The food on the table is no longer just impressive, it's unsettling. The Romans had a peculiar taste for the macabre, a fascination with dishes that would not only be unappetizing to us today, but would border on the truly grotesque. They weren't just eating to live or to show off. They were eating for a thrill, for a sense of exoticism that pushed the boundaries of what was considered edible. The first dish to arrive is a platter of roasted sow's womb. This is a common historical fact, but the way it was prepared is where the disturbing details begin. The sow, which was often pregnant, would be killed, and its womb still containing the fetuses would be carefully removed, stuffed with a mixture of spices and herbs, and then roasted. The goal was to create a dish that was both a delicacy and a conversation starter, a bold statement about the host's wealth and willingness to consume something so unusual. The texture would have been rich and fatty, the flavor gamey and intense, and the visual of it, well, you can imagine. It's a dish that blurs the line between food and a biological curiosity. Next, you might be offered a dish of dormice. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth a deeper dive. These weren't just wild dormice, they were specifically raised and fattened for the table. The glireria, or dormouse pens, were often small, dark enclosures where the mice were force-fed nuts and honey. The goal was to get them as fat as possible, a sign of their luxury. They would then be either roasted or fried, often stuffed with a mixture of minced pork and spices. The finished product was a small, crispy, fatty nugget of meat, a dish that a modern person might find a bit too close to a household pest for comfort. The Romans also had a peculiar fascination with the more unusual parts of an animal. Flamingo tongues were a prized delicacy, a symbol of extreme wealth and luxury. The emperor Elagabalus, a notorious gourmand, was said to have eaten them by the thousands. They were prized for their flavor and texture, a rich, fatty morsel that was incredibly difficult to obtain. Similarly, camel heels and parrot tongues were also considered rare treats. The idea was to consume something so rare that it was almost mythical, a culinary challenge that only the wealthiest could afford. This is a far cry from our modern idea of a prime cut of steak. It's a world where rarity and shock value were more important than flavor. Now let's talk about sauces. Remember that garum. It was the base for a lot of Roman sauces, but it was often mixed with other equally strange ingredients. The Romans had a sauce called liquamen, which was a thinner, more refined version of garum, but they also had sauces made from sea urchins, fish roe, and even fermented chicken innards. The combination of these pungent fermented flavors was designed to overwhelm the senses, a taste that was intense, salty, and a little bit rotten. It's a flavor profile that would be completely alien to us today, a testament to the fact that our modern palates have been shaped by different culinary traditions. The academic debate that still exists is whether these extreme dishes were actually eaten with gusto, or if they were more of a status symbol, a spectacle to be admired rather than consumed. Some historians argue that the Romans were genuinely adventurous eaters and that these dishes were a natural extension of their culture. Others argue that these recipes were more of a theoretical exercise, a way for cooks to show off their skills and for hosts to show off their wealth, but that the actual consumption of these dishes was probably limited. Was the sow's womb truly a delicious treat, or was it a culinary dare? It's a question that for now we can only speculate about. And then there's the truly bizarre. We're talking about dishes like the one described by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who wrote about a dish called a picient cake, which was said to be made from a mix of fish honey and a paste made from dates and spices. This sounds a bit like a Roman version of a savory cheesecake, but the ingredients, when mixed together, would have created a texture and flavor that would be truly unique. Another disturbing dish was a type of Roman sausage called botellus, which was often made with blood and offal, and was said to be so greasy and rich that it could make a person sick. The Romans were not afraid to get their hands dirty when it came to food, and they were willing to try anything, no matter how strange or off-putting it might seem to us today. So as you recline on your couch, sipping your watered-down wine and nibbling on a flamingo tongue, remember that you're not just eating a meal. You're participating in a ritual of excess, a performance of wealth and power. The food is a testament to the Romans' insatiable appetite for the new and the strange, and their willingness to push the boundaries of what was considered edible. It's a world where a dish could be a work of art, a symbol of status, and a source of disgust all at the same time. The Romans were in many ways the original foodies, but their idea of a delicacy was a world away from our own. The dinner party is reaching its climax, but a new, more sinister tension hangs in the air. We've seen how food was a tool for status and spectacle, but now we must confront a darker truth in ancient Rome. A meal could be a death sentence. The Roman elite, perpetually locked in a struggle for power and influence, used food and drink as a weapon. A dinner invitation was not just an honor, it was a gamble, and the stakes were often life and death. You're at a banquet surrounded by the usual opulence, the exotic meats, the expensive wines, the theatrical performances. But the conversation is different tonight. It's quieter, more guarded. You notice that the host, a man of immense power and wealth, has a small, trusted slave taste every dish and every sip of wine before he does. This is a common historical fact, but the chilling detail is that this practice was so widespread and so expected that it was a recognized position within a wealthy household, the pregustator, or food taster. Their job was to die so their master could live a grim insurance policy against an invisible enemy. Poisoning was a popular and effective method of assassination. It was subtle, difficult to prove, and could be easily disguised in the complex flavors of Roman cuisine. Think of the strong, salty taste of garum or the sweetness of honey. Both were powerful enough to mask the bitter taste of many poisons. The poison of choice was often something like arsenic or aconite, a potent plant-based poison. The goal was to make the death look like a sudden illness or a natural heart attack. A victim might collapse during a feast, a sudden fever, or stomach ailment, and their death would be mourned as a tragedy with no one ever suspecting foul play. The most notorious poisoners were often women, a fact that historians have long debated. Was it because they had more access to the kitchen and the food? Or was it because they were often seen as less of a threat able to operate in the shadows? Regardless of the reason, figures like Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Emperor Nero, were infamous for their alleged use of poison. She was said to have poisoned her husband, the Emperor Claudius, with a dish of poisoned mushrooms, a story that became a famous historical legend. This is a classic example of how a simple meal could be turned into a deadly weapon, a tool for political gain and personal ambition. The academic debate that still lingers is about the true extent of these poisonings. While we have a lot of anecdotal evidence and historical accounts, it's difficult to prove them definitively. The Romans didn't have the forensic science we have today, and many deaths were simply attributed to bad humors or a sudden illness. So, while we can't say for certain how many people were poisoned, the fact that the fear of it was so pervasive tells us everything we need to know. The Romans were so paranoid about being poisoned that they developed an entire culture of food tasters, counter poisons, and rituals to protect themselves. The Romans even had a god of poisons, the goddess Beneficia, a testament to how deeply the fear of poison was ingrained in their culture. They believed that certain foods could act as an antidote to poison, and they would often eat things like rue or garlic in the hope that it would protect them. This is a classic example of a society trying to find a magical solution to a very real problem. They were trying to fight an invisible enemy with a mix of superstition and a small dose of reality. The Roman fascination with poisons also led to some truly bizarre practices. The Emperor Nero, for example, was said to have a fondness for poisoning his enemies with a special kind of poisoned mushroom. And the Emperor Domitian was so paranoid about being poisoned that he had his dining room lined with a highly polished stone that would reflect the images of anyone behind him, so he could always see if someone was approaching with a knife or a cup of poisoned wine. This is a chilling detail. The emperor, a man of ultimate power, was so consumed by fear that he couldn't even enjoy a meal in peace. So as you recline at the feast watching the slaves bring out the next course, remember that the food on your plate is not just a meal. It's a symbol of power, a tool for social climbing, and for some, a potential trap. The Romans lived in a world where every meal was a gamble and every sip of wine could be your last. The dinner table, a place of family and community in many cultures, was for the Roman elite a battlefield where the stakes were higher than anywhere else. The poisoned plate is a testament to the darker side of human nature, a reminder that even in a world of opulence and grandeur, a hidden threat could be lurking just beneath the surface. We've talked about the strange foods, the deadly poisons, and the social spectacle of Roman dining. But now we're going to focus on a single unassuming liquid that ties all of it together. It's a condiment that was as essential to Roman life as salt is to ours, a flavor that permeated every kitchen, every meal, and every social class. We're talking about garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the lifeblood of the Roman culinary world. It's a truth that's both common and disturbing, a story of a condiment that was at once a miracle of preservation and a source of incredible stench. You're standing near a Roman fish market, and the air is thick with a pungent, salty smell. It's not an unpleasant smell, not exactly, but it is intense and unforgettable. This is the scent of garum being made. The process is both simple and, from a modern perspective, absolutely disgusting. Fish, usually small anchovies or other small species, are layered in large vats with salt. The vats are then left out in the sun for weeks or even months. The heat of the sun causes the fish to ferment and break down, and the salt prevents the mixture from simply rotting. The result is a liquid that is rich, salty, and full of umami flavor. It's a bit like a super concentrated fish sauce, but with a more complex, almost funky taste. The production of garum was an industry in itself. It was a big business with massive factories built along the coast of the empire. The best garum came from places like Pompeii and Spain, and it was a valuable commodity, a luxury product that was traded across the entire Roman world. There were many different kinds of garum, each with its own specific flavor and use. There was a more refined version called liquamen, a thinner, more liquid sauce. There was also muria, a sauce made from the brine of the fermenting fish. And for the really high-end stuff, there was garum sociorum, a special kind of garum made with the choicest fish, a product so expensive that it was a symbol of immense wealth. This is a common historical fact, but here's a detail that will make you wrinkle your nose. The process of making garum was incredibly smelly. The vats would be filled with rotting fish, and the stench would be so intense that the factories had to be located outside of the city walls. The smell would have been a constant presence in any coastal Roman town, a background odor that you would just have to get used to. Imagine a world where the smell of fermented fish is just a part of the air you breathe. It's a far cry from the clean, sanitized smells of our modern kitchens. The Romans had no concept of air fresheners after all. The academic debate that still rages is about the exact composition of garum. While we know it was made from fish and salt, the exact species of fish, the ratios of salt to fish, and the length of the fermentation process are all subjects of ongoing research. Archaeologists have found amphorae, the large clay jars used to transport garum with residues still inside, and they've been able to analyze them to get a better idea of what was in them. But the recipes, the exact secrets of the trade, were often closely guarded and never written down. So, while we can approximate what it was like, the true flavor of a perfect vintage of garum is something that we can only guess at. Garum was used in everything. It was a seasoning for meat and vegetables, a base for sauces, and even an ingredient in some desserts. The Romans loved the taste, and they used it to add a salty, savory kick to almost everything they ate. The ubiquity of garum is a testament to its genius as a food product. It was a way to use a perishable food source fish and turn it into a stable, long-lasting product. It was a condiment, a preservative, and a flavor enhancer all in one. It's the kind of thing that could only have been invented out of necessity, a solution to a problem that we no longer have to deal with. A truly funny moment in a dark kind of way is the story of a Roman cook who was said to have used a single bottle of expensive garum to season a banquet for an entire city. The story goes that he was so good at his job that he was able to use just the right amount of the sauce to make every dish taste perfect without overpowering it. This is, of course, probably an exaggeration, but it speaks to the high value and importance of garum in Roman society. It was a condiment that was so central to their cuisine that it became a part of their culture. You could have a meal without bread, but you couldn't have a meal without garum. So, as you recline on your couch, remember the smell of the sea, the salt, and the slow, pungent fermentation of 1,000 tiny fish. Garum is a symbol of the Roman world, a reminder that their food was born of practicality and necessity, even in the most decadent of feasts. It's a condiment that was both a miracle of preservation and a source of incredible stench, a taste that was both a delicacy and a daily necessity. And it's a taste that, for better or for worse, defined an entire culinary culture. We even explored the mortal pleasures and dangers of Roman food, but now we ascend to a different realm entirely. Food for the Romans wasn't just about sustenance or status. It was a bridge between the living and the divine. The act of eating was deeply intertwined with religion, a ritualistic practice that blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane. The same foods that filled their bellies were also used to appease the gods, to honor the dead, and to seek favor from the heavens. You're at a Roman family altar, the lararium, a small shrine in your home dedicated to the lares, the household gods and the spirits of your ancestors. The air is thick with the sweet smell of incense and the earthy scent of a small offering. This is a common historical fact, but here's a beautiful and tender detail. The offerings were often a small portion of the family meal. A piece of bread, a few drops of wine, a small cake. By sharing a meal with the gods, you were inviting them into your home, strengthening the bond between your family and the divine. The food wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a way of saying, we are all in this together, mortals and gods alike. The public rituals were on a much grander scale. At the temples, priests would perform elaborate sacrifices to the gods. An animal, a bull, a pig, or a sheep, would be led to the altar, its horns often decorated with ribbons. The animal would be killed in a ritualistic manner, and its entrails would be inspected by a priest, a practice called haruspicy, to divine the will of the gods. Then a small portion of the animal, often the bone's fat, and a small piece of the meat would be burned on the altar as an offering. The rest of the meat would then be cooked and shared among the community in a massive feast. This is a common historical fact, but here's a detail that will make you think the Roman state through these sacrifices was essentially providing a large-scale free barbecue for the people. The meat was often a rare luxury for the common Roman, and these sacrificial feasts were a way for the state to provide food, maintain social cohesion, and reinforce the power of the gods all at the same time. The Romans were in a way feeding their gods to get fed themselves. The religious aspect of the feast was for many a welcome side effect of getting a piece of meat. The academic debate that still exists is about the true nature of these sacrificial feasts. Were they a sincere act of faith, a way for the Romans to connect with their gods, or were they a pragmatic tool for the state to control the population and to provide a social safety net? The truth is probably a bit of both. The Romans were a practical people and they saw no contradiction in using a religious ritual for a political purpose. The feasts were a way to bring people together to reinforce the idea of a shared community and to remind everyone that their good fortune was a direct result of their piety. The Romans also had a peculiar and a bit morbid way of honoring the dead. During a funeral, they would often have a feast for the living, but they would also set aside a small portion of the food for the deceased. This food would be placed in the tomb as a symbolic offering to the spirit of the departed. The idea was to continue the bond of the family even in death. The food was a way of saying, "You are still with us and we are still a family." Even the gods of food had a prominent place in the Roman pantheon. Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, was one of the most important deities in the Roman world. Her festivals, the Cerealia, were a time of great celebration, with feast games and offerings. And the god Bacchus, the god of wine, was celebrated with wild ecstatic festivals called the Bacchanalia. The Romans understood that their very survival depended on the bounty of the earth, and they were more than happy to give thanks to the gods who provided it. There's a subtle joke here in the Roman mindset. You could be so pious, so devout, and still be eating a dish made with lead-laced wine and a sow's womb. The gods didn't seem to mind the dark truths of Roman cuisine. They just wanted their share. The religious rituals in many ways were just a formal, sanctioned version of the dinner party. It was a way for the Romans to show off to their gods to say, "Look how much we have, look how much we can give you." So as you recline at the feast, remember that the food on your plate is not just for you. It's for the gods, for the dead, for the community. The act of eating is a sacred one, a way of reinforcing the bonds that hold society together. The Roman table was a place where the divine and the mundane met, a place where a humble piece of bread could be both a meal for a family and an offering to a god. We've traveled through the fields and the forums, the feasting halls and the funeral pyres. Now we turn our attention to the end of the meal, to the sweet tooth that the Romans had to satisfy without the refined sugar we take for granted. This is a story of a different kind of sweetness, a taste that was more earthy, more complex, and in its own way a bit more natural. The Roman dessert was a world of honey fruit and spice, a final flourish that was often as surprising and unique as the rest of the meal. You're at the end of a grand banquet. The main courses have been cleared away, and the final course, the secundae mensae, is brought to the table. The Romans didn't have a concept of a separate dessert course in the way we do. It was just the last part of the meal, often consisting of fruit and other light fare. The most common sweet treat was without a doubt fruit. Figs, dates, grapes, and apples were all a part of the Roman diet, and they were often served fresh. But for a more decadent treat, they would be dried and then stuffed with nuts and honey. Imagine a plump, dried fig filled with a mixture of crushed walnuts and sweet golden honey. It's a simple pleasure, but it's a taste that is both rich and satisfying. Honey was the Romans' primary sweetener, and they used it in everything. It was a prized commodity, a liquid gold that was often more expensive than wine. They used it to sweeten their porridge, to make their wine more palatable, and to create a wide variety of sweet confections. One of the most popular Roman desserts was a type of cheesecake called libum, a rich and creamy mixture of ricotta-like cheese eggs and honey. It was often baked on a bay leaf, which would impart a subtle aromatic flavor. This is a common historical fact, but here's a funny detail. The Roman poet Ovid even wrote about how to make it, saying that you should make sure to have a good supply of cheese, honey, and eggs, and to make sure your hands were clean before you started. It's a moment of surprising domesticity in a world of political intrigue and military campaigns. The Romans also had a version of a fritter, or a donut. These were often made with a simple flour dough fried in olive oil and then drizzled with honey. They were a popular street food, a quick and easy way to get a sugary treat. You might find a vendor selling them hot fresh from the oil, a delicious and greasy indulgence. They were a cheap luxury, a way for the poor to get a taste of sweetness that the wealthy took for granted. The academic debate that still exists is about the health implications of the Roman diet without refined sugar. On the one hand, they didn't have to deal with the dental issues and health problems that come with a high sugar diet. On the other hand, honey is still a sugar, and the Romans' use of it, especially in their wine, could still have had some negative effects. The lack of refined sugar also meant that their desserts were often more savory and less purely sweet than ours. This is a subtle but important difference, a reminder that our modern palate has been trained to expect a certain level of sweetness that the Romans would have found strange. And then there were the truly bizarre desserts. The Romans had a recipe for a dish called savillum, a type of sweet cake made with flour, cheese, and honey. It was often served hot, and it was said to be so rich and decadent that it could make a person sick if they ate too much of it. Another disturbing dessert was a kind of pudding made from semolina and honey, often served with a sprinkling of spices. It sounds simple enough, but the Romans also had a peculiar fondness for a dessert that was made from a mixture of milk, eggs, and blood. It was said to be a rich and creamy pudding, a bit like a modern blood sausage, but sweet. This is a truly macabre dessert, a testament to the Romans' willingness to use every part of an animal, even for their sweets. The Roman sweet tooth was a reflection of their culinary world, a mix of the simple and the decadent, the natural and the bizarre. They found ways to satisfy their craving for sweetness with what they had, and they created a world of desserts that was both familiar and alien to us today. As you recline on your couch, remember that the Romans didn't need a chocolate bar or a slice of cake to end a meal. They had a world of figs, dates, and honey, a world of simple pleasures that were, in their own way, just as satisfying. The final course is finished, the wine is gone, and the guests are starting to leave. As the sounds of the banquet fade away, we are left to contemplate the legacy of this disturbing truth about ancient Roman food. We've journeyed from the humble porridge of the early republic to the flamboyant excesses of the empire, from the deadly poisons to the sacred rituals. But what does all of this mean for us here today? The Roman culinary world, for all its strangeness, is not just a historical curiosity. It's a ghost that still haunts our kitchens, a silent influence on the way we eat, and a reminder that our own food culture is just one of many possibilities. Think about the ingredients. The Romans' reliance on grains like wheat and barley, their love of legumes like lentils and chickpeas, and their use of herbs like oregano and mint. These are all staples of our modern diet. The very foundation of what we call a Mediterranean diet, a diet celebrated for its health benefits, is built on the Roman plate. The Romans didn't invent these ingredients, of course, but they were the ones who spread them across a vast empire, ensuring their survival and eventual adoption by a new generation of cultures. We are, in a way, still eating the echoes of a Roman meal every time we have a bowl of pasta or a slice of bread. And then there's the art of the meal. The Roman obsession with dining as a social event, a performance, is something that has stayed with us. The idea of a multi-course meal, the use of appetizers and desserts, the importance of presentation. These are all things that we take for granted today. The Romans were the original gourmands, the ones who elevated food from a simple necessity to a form of art. The very word cuisine is a testament to this legacy, a word that implies a level of artistry and sophistication that the Romans would have understood perfectly. But what about the disturbing parts? What about the lead-laced wine, the questionable hygiene, the bizarre dishes? These are the parts of the story that we have thankfully left behind. Our modern understanding of food safety, of nutrition, and of sanitation is a direct result of the lessons learned from our ancestors' mistakes. The Romans, in their ignorance, were a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that food is not just a source of pleasure, it is also a source of danger. Our world of pasteurized milk, refrigerated meat, and food safety regulations is a world that the Romans could never have imagined, a world built on the foundation of their many, many mistakes. The academic debate that will always continue is about the overall legacy of Roman food. Did their culinary innovations outweigh their dangerous practices? Did their love of food as an art form lead to a more sophisticated world, or did it just lead to a more decadent and dangerous one? The truth is, it was probably both. The Romans were a culture of contradictions, and their food was a perfect reflection of that. They were a people who could be both incredibly practical and incredibly wasteful, incredibly sophisticated and incredibly primitive. Their food was a mirror of their society, a reflection of all their best and worst qualities. Now, as the last of the guests leave and the candles burn down to their stubs, we can close the chapter on this strange and disturbing journey. The Roman plate is a world of contrasts, a world where the beautiful and the bizarre, the practical and the decadent, the sacred and the profane, all exist side by side. It is a world that is at once familiar and alien, a world that reminds us that our own food culture is a living thing, a constantly evolving story that has been shaped by the people who came before us. Now, let's let the sounds of the night settle in. The city is quiet, the fires are banked, and the ghosts of 1,000 Roman meals are sleeping soundly. The history of their food is a tale of survival, of power, of ritual, and of danger. It's a story that's both fascinating and at times incredibly unsettling. But it's a story that's now over a tale that has been told. So close your eyes, the sun will rise again soon. The ancient world is just a memory, and you are safe here in your own bed with your own world and your own food.